I've been working on, then Matt is, then some bits and bats in terms of useful stuff we've been using. And then for the second half today, at great expense, we are lucky enough to have booked the time of Alan Parkinson, who is going to talk to us about place. Place, I know this is for international geography teachers, but place is one of the 4 P's of the IBDP geography course, one of our key sort of concepts. And Alan's going to talk about that and really explore it and dig a little bit deeper into it. I feel, even from my own teaching and my own students, that we don't get deep enough into place. We take it quite superficially in terms of just a location, rather than some of the wonderful things that Alan's going to tickle our fancies with in a second. So we're using Google Meet here. We've got a chat option up at the top. So please, if you want to ask a question, please either drop it into the chat or wave your arms frantically or unmute yourself. There's no rules here. But what I would like you to do, just into the chat, if you could just drop where you currently are. Just tell us where you are joining us from today. It just gives us a nice sort of indication of the countries involved and where people are joining us from. That's why I have a slurp of coffee. Oh, there's a right mixture coming in. Brilliant. Radio. Many places there more interesting than Norfolk. Okay, so what I'm going to share my screen just to get things going. So just a little sort of an update of some of the things that I've been working on recently. I've presented and I've shared on various social medias before the IB Jog podcast app that I've built up. So what this is, and lots of people sort of know about this already, is it's a nice little service called Glide online, which you can use a spreadsheet in the background to build and populate an app. So this app now has, if I check, 127 podcasts which are appropriate to the IB course and sort of broken down by section. But why I'm telling people about it again is last week or the week before, with the help of Jonathan Butcher, who works in Northern Italy, I've added the urban unit. So it's not a unit I teach my students, but there's 12 or 15 podcasts there, which are all for the urban unit and sort of categorized by the syllabus point that you might find them useful by and how long they are. So that's there. Now, if anybody is teaching one of the other not optional themes, that's old language, geographic themes, which I don't do, such as leisure, sport and tourism, or leisure, tourism and sport, whatever we've called it's been called, oceans, what else is there? I'm forgetting off the top of my head. If you teach one of the other ones and you teach them with podcasts and you've got a list of podcasts you'd like to share with me, that'd be great. And then I can build it in so we can have a rounder sort of offering of things going on there. That'd be great. So that's one thing I'm working on. Oh, also, it should work much better now on a tablet device. So if you're using an iPad, it should look pretty good. And you can also install it on a desktop. And the links how to do that will be in the links document or the links page we will share at the end. What was a question that's coming in there about that? What do you need for these podcasts on? You can actually, pretty much all of them are online. So you can just play them through this app, or you can follow the link in the app to the web page where they came from. So it's actually pretty low on the requirements of that. A couple of other things. I have been working with my DP1 students. They've got their year 12 exams coming up in a couple of weeks. So I've been working with them to make Quizlets to support their revision. Now, I know there's many quizzing platforms out there. You've got your Socrates, your Quizlets, your Kahoots, all that sort of stuff. I like Quizlet because of, once you've built it up, the students have a number of options that they can do with it. They can either test with it, They can use it as flashcards. They can use it as a matching exercise. It gives them all these different options. So my year 12s had a task of going through the units. I gave them a subunit each to come up with the terms they thought they should know, and also the key bits of data from detailed examples and things. And I've gone through and checked it, and then I've put them up here. So they are all there to be used and shared with your students as you wish. I should, if time allows, add fresh water to it today and extreme environments before the end of the week. But I'm just working my way through those. So that's going at the minute. And one last thing is infographics lesson. So our last webinar was all about all things infographics, and I showed a page of resources that I've collected up. So here's this one. But what I've built from that now is an infographics lesson. So I've sort of given it a bit more of a structure. So I'm going to be looking with my students at the idea of there's easy questions in the exam, the 1-2 markers, and then there's these tricky questions, the 6 markers. I'm actually going to do this lesson in 45 minutes time with my year 12s. So it's going to get field tested in a minute, but that's available for you as well. All these links that me and Matt share, we stick on our websites, and we'll share that via the Facebook group, or we'll probably drop a link into here before the end. Right, over to you, Matthew, in terms of what you've been getting up to.
Okay, so I'm just going to switch to present screen, which takes me a moment to do. And what I've been working on actually since last night is the piece of work that I've been working on with Paul Goodson, who is over in Sao Paulo in Brazil. And he, like I, like many of you, have Igcse students. And one thing our school has asked us to do is to put together a 6-week course, because those students no longer have exams, and the course should take them up until the end of the period when they should have had their last exam. And that this work shouldn't be any type of IB teaching, but should provide them with some skills, knowledge, and understanding to kind of help them to adapt to the course they're going to be doing next year. So some of you will have seen that I'd posted some of these little booklets, and Paul had come up with this really good idea of, I think he'd put together 9 or 10 lessons in total. I don't have time to do that many. And so what I've done is I've created a page on my teaching site where I'm just going to dump the worksheets, the work packs, and for some strange reason Facebook won't let me upload Word documents, but it does let me upload PDFs, which are not great if you guys want to edit stuff. So I'll fire across the link to this site shortly on the chat. But I'm up to lesson 3, or each of these are 2 lessons. They're 2 hours worth of work. So we've done the SDGs, we did the circular economy last week, an introduction to that, an introduction to Nexus. Don't worry, no hexagons this week. And the last 3 aren't yet uploaded because I generally do them on Sundays. So as I go through this, I'm going to be looking at superpowers next week, cultural imperialism and disruptive technology. And again, they're pretty standard if you've seen these. They generally have a read, watch, and listen task at the beginning. So a podcast task, a YouTube video, and an article. And what I've tried to do this week for the Nexus was to start to introduce the concept of infographics and analysing infographics and looking at infographics. It's nothing as in-depth as they would do next year, but just to get them used to the idea of trying to glean geographical information from an infographic. But the one last week, I'd put an additional task at the end, which uses a really, really good book if you ever have the chance to buy it, and I'll put the link to it. Paul Igcse, which is this thing called Everything We Touch. And at the end of each task, generally every week, I have 2 questions they could choose to answer, or if they fancy doing something a bit more creative, then they can have a go at that. And that was based on this book by Paul Igcse, which is basically a photography project of all the physical objects that a person touches in a day. From the moment they wake up, no surprise that's often a mobile phone, to the moment they go to bed. No surprise that's often a mobile phone. With that, we can start to, I've asked the students to start turning that into a photo project where they can start to identify products that might have a circular economy type makeup. So they're all on there on the website, and they've got the Word version and the PDF version, so you can take those as you want. The second thing I've been working on is going back to IGCSE and trying to rationalise, in particular, the physical geography units that I'm teaching at the moment. I grew up right on the coast, as Kelvin, who's on here, knows, and my geography classroom used to overlook the sea. I've got lots of ways of teaching coast that involve me jumping around, practical demonstrations, knocking kids into each other. There's all sorts of things that I can't do remotely, and so I'm kind of making this a bit more step by step in terms of what we do. And I've been sort of leaning quite heavily on these guys. I've mentioned them before, but Time for Geography, these free instructional videos, which are superb. And they're just these quick, 3-4 minute explanations. And they do the things that, Elliot Brown videos or Bernard, I forget his surname, in the olden days before that, used to do. And one particular type of video they've got, which I've started embedding at the end of each section, is these sample IGCSE questions, these model answers, and it's well worth having a look at those. And my students have really appreciated, although it's made for a GCSE spec, it works pretty well for IGCSE as well. And they talked through how to structure answers to questions based on what they've just been looking on. So that's gone particularly well. Again, I've been doing a little bit of work with grade 8 or year 9, as you might know. Then we've been looking at the Human Development Index, although I remember doing that, and when it was quite new. It's over 30 years old now, and so a photo of me around about that time. Plus, I've been asking them to get together on teams, trying to promote as much group work as possible at the moment. And they've had to produce a rant or a speech that they're going to make in front of the United Nations, advocating for the inclusion of one further development. I think this would take the form of a balloon debate next year in the class, but this year it's simply them doing a rant, and they're choosing anything from gender equality, happiness, peace, democracy, crime levels, and there's a few things in there linking to the Sustainable Development Goals. So that's been encouraging my year 9 students to be a little bit more creative with what they're doing. And then I've just finished resourcing the 3rd unit of leisure sport tourism. So put in there some work on the London 2012 Olympics and the World Cup in South Africa in 2010. Nice contrasting locations, and put some finishing touches to the Glastonbury Festival, which of course is that concept of temporary place, which Alan's going to talk to you a little bit more about shortly. So that's kind of everything I've been working on since last time.
Just in terms of interesting bits and bats that I've found recently, I have this cropped up on Twitter or Facebook, I can't remember which one recently, but this is a set of population density, I don't know, would you call them an infographic or representations? And these are brilliant. These are absolutely fantastic. I think just to look at them, if they did large posters for classrooms, there'd definitely be a market from me anyway. But I think these are super useful for looking when you're doing population density, which is part of Unit 1 if you're doing the IB. So that's quite interesting. Having a look at those, though, reminded me of one of my favourite sites, which I try to use when I'm teaching, which is the Human Terrain, which is from the Pudding, which is this idea of these population sort of peaks and things, which I think is super. And what's really nice is that you can show change as well. So you've got areas in red which show decline and areas in green which show growth, which, I mean, this is France at the minute, but if you look at some of the data on when you're doing internal migration and things within the course, this is a super sort of interesting and useful thing to do. You can go right into Geneva here and see where people are leaving and people are going to. So that's super useful. That's about it in terms of useful bits and bats that I found this week. Matt, have you got anything to throw in to the mix?
Yeah, just a couple of things really that have come up since last time. One of them, just in my share screen again, I will post a link to this shortly, is if you follow Becky Quigley, she's out in the UAE. She shared a Google Drive, which is full of graphics that she's put together, which would be great for the classroom, great for various elements of IGCSE and IB, GCSE and A-level too. And she's put together these really nice looking, good explanations, very visual, of all these different concepts that we might run into in our various studies of geography. So if I just go back, you'll see the folders full of these, and each one of these folders is, each one of these documents is several pages of good quality posters. So have a little look at those, they're pretty good. And the last thing was that there was a brilliant webinar last week by Discover the World Education, and it was about sustainable tourism in rural Iceland. Because of my children at home, I find it quite difficult to attend lots of daytime things. So I've caught up with this in the evening when they've gone to bed. But this is perfect, especially if you're doing the leisure sport tourism, especially if you're looking at Iceland like I am, and this whole thing about the purism scale, which I'd never come across before. I need to go back and quickly adapt some of the work that I did. So if you get a chance to catch up with this section, with this website, particularly from 20 minutes onwards on the video, it is absolutely superb. Again, I'll post the link to the YouTube video shortly on the site. So yes, Becky Quigley, amazing classroom posters, and a very, very good webinar on sustainable tourism in rural Iceland.
Okay, so before I hand over to Alan, who is the main reason you've all come along, is just to talk about the next one. So we're trying to do these every 3 weeks, and we're going to do one more in season 1 before Netflix offer us a deal for season 2. We're in conversations about that at the minute. We'll start again in September is the plan. But the last one, the plan is to do, or the second half of it to be based around the idea of top tips for teachers new to teaching DP geography. So the idea is between now and then, you'll see plenty of it on Facebook and things. I've just dropped a link into the chat here. It's just for a form. And into that form, if you have got a top tip that you wish you knew when you were starting DP geography, and you can drop that into there, that would be brilliant. What me and Matt will do between now and then is build up a sort of a slide deck with these in. We'll credit you, links to Twitter and all that sort of stuff if you want to put those in. But we're just looking for your top tips for teachers. We're saying teachers new to DP geography. They don't have to be new. I'm sure everybody will get something out of this. But if you can do that and fill that in, and then me and Matt can do something with it for 3 weeks' time. So I'm going to hand over to Alan, who will introduce himself in many ways and talk to us about place. So over to you, Mr. Parkinson. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rich, and thanks everyone for joining in with the webinar today. Rich asked me to talk about the idea of place, so that's what I'm going to do for about sort of 20-25 minutes. I'll pause about halfway through, chance for some questions. If I just bring up my presentation. The presentation is going to be shared with you afterwards, along with links to any of the resources that I mentioned. So if there's something that comes up here, you will get access to that afterwards. And if you have any questions, then please feel free to ask them. I'll put my contact details up next. But I'm going to start with this picture. Now, this is a picture of a bus. It's a bus I caught many, many times, hundreds of times when I was younger. And this picture was taken in the 1970s in a town in South Yorkshire in England called Rotherham, which is my hometown. So I remember catching that bus. I remember sitting on the top deck, hopefully in the front seat, because then you can imagine that you're driving the bus. And back then, of course, people on the top deck would have been smoking. Those shops there, the sort of fashions, all of those things have disappeared and changed. So this place is really somewhere in the past. So places exist obviously as part of a location, but they're also, in a sense, time travel. So when you visit a place, you're also time traveling, and I'm going to come back to that idea in a second. So that's me roughly now. There's my details. I'm a head of geography at a school in Cambridgeshire called King's Ely. I'm also on Twitter at GeoBlogs, and if you have any questions, please email me afterwards. Now that's me when I first began exploring place, the concept of place, because right from an early age, right from when we're babies, we begin exploring. We begin to push the boundaries. We begin to be curious about, what's around the corner, and that's innate in our human nature. Now, it seems from this image that I wasn't a particular fan of coasts from an early age, but I did quite like limestone gorges. So that's me in Cheddar Gorge with my mum and my grandparents. So clearly, from an early age, we start visiting places. Now, I'm going to refer to this document a couple of times. This is in an article which you'll get a link to by Alaric Maud, who's an Australian educator. And this was published last month, and it looks at geography concepts and powerful knowledge. So clearly, the concept of place has the potential to be powerful geographical knowledge. But for many people, they don't think of the concept of place. They think of the word places. So they think, if you're a geographer, you must know the capital city of every country because that's a place. And so really they're thinking on it at really the bottom level there, step one. We live in places. Now, what I'm going to talk about is how we can shift our thinking about place up through those levels. Level 2, places are important to our security, identity, and sense of belonging. I think a lot of us have been finding out quite a lot more about our local place over the last few months because we've been locked down. If we're able to take exercise, perhaps we've found a little path or a little part of our local area which we hadn't found before because we weren't looking hard enough, because we hadn't been taking the time really to think about that as much as we are now. So place has become more important to us, I think, over the last few months. And we're also missing places. And our students are missing places. Our students are missing school. They're missing that sense of security, identity, and sense of belonging, that level 2 idea there that school gives to them and gives to us. So I'm going to try and push us up towards the top of that level, where we're actually thinking about how place affects our lives, about how where we live and grow up influences who we are. And so that picture of that bus in Rotherham, I haven't lived in Rotherham for over 30 years. I've spent more than half my life living in Norfolk, but I would consider myself still to be a Yorkshireman. So that place has given me my identity. Now within the IB, place is one of the 4 Ps. It's in the diagram here, and if we zoom into the definition of place, according to the IB, this is how it's defined. They talk about the idea of unique in some way, and about being able to compare places with others, and also the real or perceived characteristics. Because if we haven't been to a location that we're teaching about, then very often we might actually be teaching something that isn't necessarily true. It's the perception that we have of that place. And even if we do live in that place, we still only have our own perceptions and our own knowledge of it when we're teaching too. So that's something to consider. Now, if we think about another definition of place then, this is about adding meaning to a location. So places are locations, but with meaning. And those meanings are ascribed by different groups. There's a cultural bias, perhaps, in some of these places and how they're identified. Now, Alaric Maud says places are the context in which things happen, and they have an influence on what happens. And clearly, we often might consider that, when we're teaching, we don't bring out the uniqueness of places. For example, if we're learning about cities, many of the models assume that cities behave the same. If it's a city, it behaves like this because it's a city. But actually, every city has its own unique characteristics. And so we need to avoid those sort of generic treatments of places and try and delve a little bit deeper into their unique or distinctive characteristics. Now, Simon Oakes, who has written quite a lot about the IB, does IB training. Some of you may have used his books. This is his definition of place. And he uses the phrase a palimpsest. It's a word you may have heard before. It's the idea of a layered history. The idea that when you look at a place, the identity of it is built up over time in a series of layers. And that actually each place is accumulation of imprints of physical and human processes. So the place where you're right now is clearly built up from a number of factors. And those give that place a meaning. The meaning is obviously sometimes chosen, sometimes it's described. So this is a place called Hunstanton. It's on the coast in Norfolk in the UK. And as you arrive in Hunstanton, there's a sign describing it as a Victorian seaside town. Now, the Victorian age was the age when Hunstanton became popular with tourists, when thousands of people arrived by train. They don't do that anymore. There are very few Victorian buildings. The train station has disappeared. There is very little to connect Hunstanton with that Victorian age. And yet that's how it has chosen to identify itself, perhaps because that was a time when it felt or was more significant. So do we have that same, I guess, branding of places that persists with a historical angle? This is an aerial view of Hunstanton. As you can see, it's by the coast. And if you look at the top left there, there's a sort of an area of beach. And that area of beach has a special meaning to me, because it's where, just over 20 years ago, I proposed to my wife. Now, right now, there will be people on that beach who will be walking past that very spot, and their only intention perhaps is, to take their dog for a walk and just have a little bit of freedom. That space has meaning for different people at different times. So when we're teaching about places, leave space for those meanings for the students to come out, especially if you're teaching about the local area. And if we look at the local scale, you can't get much more local than this. This is a photography project by a Ukrainian photographer. And he spent 2 years documenting the people who sat on a park bench opposite his apartment. Now, you could argue that that place is a fixed location. It is a place. And obviously, every time a different group of people sat on that bench, they had conversations, they perhaps had meaningful conversations. Maybe they were breaking up with a partner, maybe they were meeting somebody for the first date, maybe they had an important phone call while they were sat there, or made a decision about their life. And so that park bench is as worthy of study, I guess, as a large city, because it's a place which has meaning. It's a place which is significant to groups of people, and it's affected by certain factors. And one of the factors is the fact of where it is. So these are what's called endogenous factors. They create the place's identity. So that bench is located somewhere. It has a particular topography. And so if you think about where you are right now, some of these things will apply to your local area. But those are then affected by exogenous factors, external influences on a place. People move into the place. We have investment, we have change. We have ideas from planners or architects about changing the place. And sometimes those factors change a place for the better, and sometimes they change it for the worse. And at the moment, you could argue that COVID-19 is a huge, hopefully temporary, exogenous factor. It is changing places more than they have changed before. London has never looked like this. The removal of people from these bustling cities has changed the nature of those places, and that's quite unsettling. And so for the young people we teach, there's also this unsettling way in which familiar places are becoming quite unfamiliar. And there's a word here for this, which is canopsia. And your schools feel like this now, perhaps. If you've been into school, you know, they're changed places. The stickers, the one-way systems. I think when students return, they're going to find that school itself has changed, and there's going to be an adaptation to that change. So places then as emotional connections, places on a local scale, all of these are opportunities for us to bring this into the curriculum, particularly lower down the school, where we can really start to hit this idea of place. Now, I've been fortunate to be asked to write some books, some textbooks, for a number of qualifications in the UK. These two here are recent books, and as part of that, I had to make choices about which places to choose to teach. And I guess you're doing the same. You're all teachers. You're going to be selecting which case study, which example to use. If you're teaching about cities, which city do you choose? And so I took part in a bit of research that somebody was doing for their PhD. Now, I'm not suggesting you read the whole of this thesis, but if you want to access it, it's by Emma Rowling-Smith. And what she did was she asked a load of textbook authors, why do you choose the places that you do? Why did you choose that particular city? Because whenever you choose to teach something, you have made a choice not to teach something else. So our choices as teachers are important. Our choices of places are important. Now, place also wraps around our other teaching. So if we're teaching about coasts, for example, as Matt mentioned earlier, clearly coasts are a combination of physical factors. So we have geology and the landforms and the weathering and so on. And the idea of place essentially wraps around that. Now, place can also be a context for a setting, for a narrative. So place is also linked with the idea of stories. If we think about Iceland, for example, the use of Iceland as a location for Game of Thrones opened up for many their appreciation, I guess, of that landscape. And those of us who've been to Iceland before could play the game of trying to spot where these locations were. Nan Shepherd's famous book on the Cairngorms in Scotland, almost describing the mountain as a living thing. And so places then are important in giving us our particular identity. And at the moment, of course, with the changes of Brexit and so on, many people in the United Kingdom are finding themselves, I guess, thinking about their place within Europe. I'm going to pause there for a second and just ask whether there are any questions that anybody has. Has any questions come in the chat?
Anybody got any questions for Alan while we have him here? Key opportunity to say something. Go on, somebody. Like my year 12 class on a Monday morning, this.
Okay, thanks, Kelvin. Right, shall I crack on then with the second half? Now, in the second half, I'm going to give you a few more ideas for resources and ideas for teaching this, really, and a few sort of tools that you might use to explore place. Let me go back to my presentation. Okay, so the next thing I want to think about is how we think about the social construction of place. Every place is a product of its history. That's the formal history, but also the personal histories of places. And you may be aware of a geographer called Doreen Massey. And Doreen Massey makes the point that even when we have a place we think of as being a fixed location, everywhere is actually moving. So wherever you are right now, even if you have been in that location locked down for 2 months, you've still moved. The tectonic plates have moved. The Earth has moved through space. And so every place is in a process of flux, of change. And that place attachment then is quite significant, because that also may change. We may actually not have found yet the place where we really belong. We might feel a little bit restless. We might want to actually find our place. Or it may be that you found the exact place you want to stay for the rest of your life. You might be very happy where you are. So places are socially constructed. This is a picture I took at Guttelfoss a few years ago with some year 8 students. And those students are now in year 13. They still remember this location. They still can appreciate the power of water to change the landscape because of their visit to this location. So people make places. Places change over time. Here's another picture of me as a young boy, 1967. That dates me. And here's the same arch 40 years later. Now, I do this quite a lot. I use old postcards. Facebook has groups for many cities, many locations. There will be a group that you can find where people are sharing old photographs, old postcards, old brochures. And so I've got lots of examples of this, and you can see that the arch has grown in size and scale. It's grown in width, and the boulders that I was stood on as a young boy have disappeared. So you can see the process of erosion over the 40-year period there, and you can then compare that perhaps with other longer scale changes on this coastline. And of course, you might project that forward into the future. What's this going to look like in another 40 years? And at the moment, of course, the idea of place is very much in our minds. For example, if we go to the supermarket, we're really entering a negotiation about place. Who's going to occupy a particular part of the aisle? Are we going to wait for a particular person to make their selection before moving? Can we pass them safely? Those negotiations about place mirror, I guess, the larger scale negotiations over certain places, the positioning of boundaries and borders, the contested territories, sort of Kashmir, the sort of Ukraine, Russia areas where there have been conflicts about place in the past. And I guess equally there might be conflict here. If you've got people who are not sticking to the social distancing, I can imagine that people's emotions right now are running high, and there could be conflict over just the idea of what 2 meters constitutes, the idea of distance becoming really significant here. And so if you go back to Alaric Maud's list then, we've looked at level 3 about how we live in a place. We have services, facilities. With level 4, we have our attachment to places, and this use of communication technologies is important. We've all been Zooming. You know, we've all found out more about the interior of our colleagues' houses than we ever would have done before, because you know, we're all looking at each other. Maybe you've tidied up this morning so that you know, we can see a nice tidy space behind you. My pebbles are becoming famous across Europe because they appear in all my presentations. So we're moving up the level. And we're moving towards, I guess, level 6 there, where this is a significant one, isn't it? The places in which we grow up have an influence, but not a determining one, on their health. Now, I would say that at the moment, we have an impact on health depending on our location. If you're in New Zealand, you're possibly going to be potentially healthier and a lower risk than if you're in other parts of the world. And this book is a really a good read. It's by Alexander Murphy. It's called Geography Why It Matters. And he talks about that idea of where you live making a difference. The YouTube link there takes you through to a lecture that he did, which you can look at if you're interested in following up that book. It doesn't take very long to read. It's a nice look at why geography matters. And it's a reminder then that places are dynamic. At the moment, Australia and New Zealand are proposing a travel bubble, that there will be the chance to travel between those two countries, but the other countries would not be allowed into that arrangement. And so you have that sense of people being excluded from places. Again, something that Doreen Massey very much was into, sort of social relations, the power relations of place. And that actually it's very difficult to disassociate any place from others, because wherever you are, there's still going to be connections with other places. If I go to the supermarket later, I'm going to find food from countries which it's impossible to travel from in person, and yet the food has made it here. So there are those connections. But it is important to look at that idea with students, the idea of exclusion, how places might be excluding people, or how people might feel excluded from places. A lot of our city centres, for example, are actually private property rather than public property. And there's that negotiation of where you can walk and what you can do. And sometimes security guards will step in. And if you're in a shopping mall, for example, and you take a photograph, you can find yourself in trouble because actually you're on private land. So the ownership, I guess, of places is something that's worth considering with people when you're looking at cities and who owns the city. I'm going to be looking at my local area next term, because we have a competition run in the UK. The Royal Geographical Society run a competition, and the theme this year is Beyond the Window, Geography Beyond the Window, which I think would be a brilliant example of a holiday project to set your students to research the geography beyond their own windows. I also use quite a lot of Instagram images in my teaching, and this photographer here, Jungraphy, takes these amazing images of Japanese cities at night. This image of Shinjuku Station, which usually has something like 4 million passengers a day, and yet right now is very much quieter than it has ever been before. And so it's an opportunity perhaps for fieldwork, perhaps local fieldwork. This is my colleague Claire Kint's diagram suggesting things to look at on local fieldwork. The Field Studies Council ran a fieldwork live event recently, and in the documents that are being shared, there are some ideas for doing some local fieldwork for students while they're on lockdown, still to do some geography, because fieldwork obviously is something we've all had curtailed. We've had to cancel perhaps field excursions, trips, trips abroad, trips locally, but it is possible to do fieldwork still. And of course, what that does is it allows you to change that position on this framework, this idea that places exist on their different scales and in different times. Now, this article by David Wolman in Wired, I think, is a brilliant piece of writing. It basically suggests that we are now all, not just us, but the whole population, is considering geography. They are realizing that the concept of elsewhere is a fiction. Where matters absolutely. Geography is back with a vengeance, he describes in the title. But we're all thinking about where. We're all thinking about where we're going to go and where we're going next, essentially. And so what I've done is start to put together a document, which again is under links, about how geography might change when we do go back, our post-corona geographies. And part of that, there's a field excursion suggestion by my colleague Claire, which asks your students to look in their local area and look for evidence that we do have a pandemic. And that might be signs in windows, it could be stickers on the ground, it could be these pebbles here that have been left outside a house for people to help themselves. These small connections that we're making with our neighbours now that we didn't make before. So just to conclude, if we go back to the bus again, that is my place, but that place has changed. I found the same location in Google Street View, same place, and yet the Rotherham has changed. Some of the shops have closed down. In fact, most of the shops have closed down. the roads being pedestrianised. There are lots of sort of pawnbrokers and cash shops and cheap shops. It's a place which has declined quite considerably in its sort of retail offering, and demographically it's changed as well. And so it's a reminder that wherever we are, wherever we live, if we go back several decades later, we're not going back to the same place. The place will have changed. You go back to the Mer de Glace, within a few years, there's extra steps on the steps down to the glacier. The glacier is melting away. The place is changing. And if you do find a picture of a place and you're wondering where it is, then you can use a web tool called TinEye. TinEye is a reverse image search. So instead of asking for an image, this one will tell you where the image is found. So if you come across an image on the internet and you think, that's actually really useful, but I don't know where it is, put it into TinEye, and it will tell you where on the internet that image has been used, and it will tell you the location from the website. So that's quite a useful little tool that I use. Another little tool, just to finish, is this one. This is a population estimation site. You draw out a circle, and it will tell you an estimate of how many people live within that circle. So you can draw your own circles, create your own circles, and you get an indication of population. And clearly population density right now is significant. If you're close to lots of other people, you have an additional risk. And to finish, I really would suggest, if you have the chance, to watch this TED Talk. Oliver Jeffers is a children's author. He wrote this book about, I guess, the place where we all live, planet Earth. He wrote it for his young child, but in the TED Talk, he talks really, really nicely about why where we live matters and how we need to look after it and each other. And if you get a chance to get a copy of the book, it's a lovely little resource for younger students. And with that, and this provocative image of an artwork in London, I will stop. And if there are any questions, then I'm happy to answer them.
Any questions for Alan on his brilliant presentation? There's some dropping into the chat, I think, Alan.
Okay.
How do you suggest bringing in more of a focus on concept of place without losing time? Catherine, in terms of sort of weaving it in, I think it's just doing it little and often. I mean, and there's various, I mean, you'll notice from the subunits of the IB course that each of them, if you look at the geographical inquiry statement, there's always a place, you know, one of the concepts is sort of inferred or pushed towards. And when those ones are, you know, when it's place-based, just making sure that that is a theme that comes into your lesson, and it's one of the questions you're asking. So, for example, I've just been doing the megacity growth part of Unit 1, and we spent 2 lessons, rather maybe 1 lesson, looking at Shanghai and looking at how it's changed over time. And that's, I don't think you need necessarily particular lessons on place. It's just making sure that when it does come up in the syllabus, you're spending more time on it. And then it also links in with the things that Matt's been saying and supporting with these booklets and things and stuff. If you've got an opportunity before you hit the course, to make sure that you're spending some time looking at that sort of thing. So, for example, I start the course off with 4 lessons where I mix in some ATL skills, how to make notes and all that sort of stuff. But one of them is on place, one of them is on possibilities, one of them is on processes, and they are the themes that I address. So it's always ranting at them about the 4 Ps, and maybe the secret 5th P, perspectives. Ooh, there you go. There's a theme for another webinar in the future. The secret 5th P, I reckon there is, but you could say stakeholders, but I like the idea of perspectives. Anything else before some of us have to run into a lesson? Leave this Google Classroom and join another, Google Meet and join another one. Anything else out there?
Yeah, I mean, we had a question about choice of places. I guess one of the things that you can do, depending on your situation and if you're teaching younger students, is to train them up in this thinking about place early, so that when you get to the exam specs, they're familiar with the idea of looking at places in particular ways, perhaps using the idea of spectacles, where you look through the specs and you look at the place in a particular way. So if you look at a city from the perspective of somebody who lives there, rather than somebody who's visiting, rather than somebody who might be homeless in that city, they're all living in the same place, but they're looking at it slightly differently. And obviously also giving time for young people to give their thoughts on places, that you are not the only geographer in the room. All the students you teach are geographers. They've all been to places. And teaching where I do in an international school with international community, very often there's a greater understanding of some of the places I'm teaching because they've actually been there or lived there, and I haven't. So bearing that in mind too. Matt?
Yeah, just to say, thank you very much. It clearly has huge links in with option G in urban, leisure, sport and tourism, the population unit. And again, one thing I try to do here as much as possible is to look local. Some of our kids live in a little bit of a bubble sometimes, and they don't have to look very far to see some of these processes that we teach them about. And so whilst we go across to the United States and China quite often, we look to South America, being able to see these things on a daily basis around you, I think that's particularly important. It doesn't have to be standout amazing example. It can just be something very mundane in your local area that really draws their attention to it, walk or drive past every day. So yeah, I'd just like to say a big thanks. I don't know if Rich is back. He seemed to have left his own meeting then.
Yeah, no, I'm back. Sorry. It's because I've got students trying to enter another meet, so I need to run, which is going to close this one down. So
yeah. I've got grade 11 now, looking at tourism hotspots, so I must go as well, I'm afraid.
I'm off to do some infographics. So thank you, Alan. Thank you, everybody, for joining. Keep your eye on the Facebook group for links to the next one, and also be thinking about the tips that you would give for other people new to the course. But thank you very much. Stay in touch and stay on the Facebook group. So bye. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye. Thank you.